Can I welcome everyone to this meeting of the Cabinet Committee Regeneration on Wednesday the 7th of June from the Walton Suite, Winchester Guildhall. The time is 10 a.m. My name is Councillor Martin Todd, Chairperson of the Cabinet and Cabinet Member for Asset Management. This meeting is live streamed from the Council's YouTube channel, and the recording will also be available after the meeting. Subtitles can be switched on, and advice on how to turn these on is set out on our website. Can everyone please ensure mobile phones are on silent, and can I remind members to use their microphones? In the unlikely event that it is necessary to evacuate the building, the fire alarm will sound. Please follow all the instructions given to you by our team. It's worth just adding, for the benefit of members of the public, that agenda item 7 includes exempt appendices, and should Cabinet wish to discuss their contents, then we will have to ask all members of the public to leave the meeting and wait in the rather fine wood-panelled mayor's parlour on the floor below. An officer will show you the way. When we have finished, we will come back into open session, and if you wish to rejoin us for the discussion of Central Winchester Regeneration at that point, you will be more than welcome. Turning to the agenda, the first item on the agenda is apologies for absence. We have apologies from Councillor Cunningham. The second is disclosures of interest. I need to declare a personal but not prejudicial interest as a county councillor, since there are some issues that relate to highways and other such questions within the papers we're discussing today. Are there any other declarations of interest? The next item is a request from councillors to speak, and Councillor Wallace has said he would like to say a few words on item 7 and item 8, and I'm assuming you'd like to wait until that part of the agenda to do so. The fourth item on the agenda is public participation. We have no requests for public participation in this meeting, and the fifth item of the agenda is approval of the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 9th of March 2023. Cabinet, are you agreed that I should approve those minutes?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item number 6 on the agenda is Chair's announcements, and I have no specific extra announcements other than relates to the papers we have in front of us today. And so that brings us to item 7, which is the station approach paper. So we will start with an introduction. So I'll say a few words, then Emma Taylor will say a few words, and I think Hugo Braddock will take us through the presentation. Then Councillor Wallace will have a chance to make his deputation or his comments, and then I will respond to that, and then we'll respond to those comments, and then we will move into a wider debate on the committee. So what we have in front of us today effectively is a capacity study which was set up to answer the question, do we have a project here? Do we have something that says that we are able to go forward? Do we have viable options? And as you will hear shortly, it shows that we do. Construction costs have made our lives a great deal harder, but it's clear that we have meaningful options, particularly for Carfax and the Kettle Market, although a lot of our choices on the latter are dependent on the provision of a North Park and Ride. It also highlights the journey towards the next decision-making point of a strategic outline case in July, where we would then be taking a decision as to what exactly the next step of the process would look like on the journey, with a master plan or other decisions that we can take in terms of how to progress the project. But Ms. Taylor, would you like to introduce the paper in a bit more detail?
Thank you, Councillor Todd. In July last year, Cabinet agreed a new approach for station approach and a number of work streams to determine whether a viable project could be brought forward for station approach. This report, accompanied by the presentation that Hugo is going to take us through from Howard Tompkins, is going to provide the results of the capacity study work that we've undertaken from October last year until March of this year. The capacity study has sought to test development potential of different land uses across the sites on the station approach that are owned by the council and those of Network Rail. The study identifies the constraints and opportunities of those sites and helps us inform us whether a viable project could be taken forward, whether that's worthy of further investigation. We've also considered the market conditions and feedback from residents and stakeholders during our initial stakeholder engagement last year. That's all been fed into the capacity study work, as well as council policies, priorities and planning policy. The work's also been guided by development principles that we developed jointly with Network Rail and London Continental Railways and was endorsed by the public during the consultation period. The different options that we have explored for commercial viability have all been tested by our cost and commercial consultants, ICON, to establish if there is any of those options that are commercially viable at this point in time. I must stress to you that the capacity study's job is to just advise us if the project is worthy of taking further consideration, a further investigation at this time. It's not to provide us with designs or to tell us what is actually going to be built on the sites. That will come at later stages should the council wish to progress the project. So I'm now going to hand over to Hugo, that's going to take us through the findings of the capacity study. Hugo.
Are working okay? Yeah. Hi everybody. So my name's Hugo Braddock. I'm Associate Director at Howth Tompkins Architects. I'll just share screen. Hopefully you can all see some version of that on the screens in front of you. So the project scope, as many of you are familiar with already, was to carry out capacity and options appraisals for 4 sites around the station owned by Winchester and Network Rail. And the study was jointly commissioned by Winchester and Network Rail LCR. So we carried out the work over about a 4-month period from October 22 to February 23. And in this, we were supported by a team of specialist consultants. So ourselves, Howth Tompkins as lead and architecture, heritage architecture, inputting on heritage issues, and Sistra on transport, who know the Winchester area well from a transport point of view. And as Emma has mentioned, we've been guided through the process by the development principles agreed by the council for connected sustainable development for Winchester's future, high quality placemaking and positive design, and consultation and co-creation with stakeholders, residents and business.
Sorry, excuse me, I think your microphone's just dropped out. Could you just press the button again?
Yeah. Sorry, do I have to be within a certain distance of it maybe? There's an extensive public consultation process carried out by Winchester over summer and autumn 22. So that included online surveys, site walks, interactive maps, consultation events, newsletters, social media and media coverage.
Is there a way of making it? I think there's a pin.
Just taking everybody else off.
She's probably good.
Is that as big as we go?
That's as big as we go, unfortunately.
I'll try and describe clearly. Alongside that public engagement process, we've carried out a more technical engagement with stakeholders. So during the course of the study, we've spoken to the Winchester Planning Department and the Archaeology and Sustainability teams HCC transport teams, and we've had various briefing sessions with councillors as part of the stakeholder group and project team. So the 4 sites, you can see them up on the screen in pink, are Carfax and Cattle Market, and 2 sites called Station West and Station East, which are the Network Rail sites either side of the train tracks. They're all clustered around the centre of Winchester. They're all key sites. They're all key sites of different shapes and sizes. Accommodating a lot of parking at the moment, and parking's been a really key parameter for the study in general. They vary in size and shape, and they all offer really good opportunities to improve the town centre of Winchester and potentially important sites in the area. As we've developed layouts and capacity studies for each of the sites, as Emma sort of mentioned, it's not a design exercise in terms of designing actual buildings or master planning, so we haven't been considering appearance, details, materials and so on. It's about establishing how much of what different type of use we felt each site could accommodate, and then testing the viability for that. But in the work we've done, we've tried to be cognizant always of the history of the sites and the context of the city. So Winchester is obviously an incredibly high quality historic town with a lot of excellent historic buildings and fabric. It has a traditional town centre layout with a historic core. The station is close to that core, and there's a wide mix of uses within the area around the station. Typically, a lot of the street patterns are historic, so 19th century Victorian terraces. There's a lot of low-rise buildings of 2 to 4 stories with some higher elements within those, and fairly irregular street patterns. Also very green character, excellent green character to Winchester generally in terms of street trees and greenery. And a few examples on the screen of just some of that high quality historic character and fabric. So I think we were very aware as we developed designs of trying to bring forward layouts and massings that would be feasible in planning terms within that context. Another key factor that we've considered is pedestrian routes and connectivity. All 4 of the sites have pedestrian and vehicle routes within them and across them at the moment. Some of those are functioning reasonably well. In other cases, there are desire lines for pedestrian movement that aren't accommodated well at the moment, and we've responded to those constraints in the layouts we've developed. And we've also, with the help of Sistra, our transport consultant, tried to take into account the broader transport context for Winchester, which is complicated. There's a lot of moving parts to it. So there are various other pieces of work that have fed into our work, car use and parking surveys by Fatkins, other parking assessments that have been done. We're aware of the mobility hub and bus route improvement ideas coming forwards. And we've also had an opportunity to look at the data on parking around the stations post-COVID and understand what opportunities that has offered as well. So very briefly, this slide summarises the level of parking around the 4 sites at the moment. So on Station West, on the left-hand side of the image, we've got around 410 spaces between the 2 car parks, so the surface car park to the north and the deck car park to the south. On Cattle Market, on the top right of the slide, we've got something like 300 spaces altogether across the parking there. On Station East, which is in the centre of the screen, number 3, we've got the 2-storey deck car park giving 250 spaces. And then, on Carfax, we've got 213 spaces at the moment. And very, very briefly, in summary, the brief and the conclusion is that Carfax is available and can have the parking that's currently on it removed and be available for development. Cattle Market that's not the case for immediately, and that needs to retain parking in the short to medium term. So any development option for that site would have to look at other ways to accommodate that parking, whether that's a northern park and ride or by intensifying the parking on the site. And on the 2 station sites, although average levels of use have dropped quite significantly post-COVID, so people working from home 2 days a week on average. We're seeing something like a 35% drop, I think, on average use of those car parks altogether. However, they are still being used at very close to full capacity at peak times. So there's a significant, that's obviously commuters coming in to park and use the station and town centre. So there's a significant parking constraint on those sites as well. And broadly speaking, the options we looked at were, in order to develop one of the sites, you potentially have to re-provide parking on one of the other sites. So in the capacity studies themselves that we've carried out, we've looked at 4 or 5 different uses and typologies of those uses. So this slide just briefly illustrates, to give you a visual impression of size more than anything, what those typologies have been. So in terms of residential uses, we've looked at low-rise housing, so 2 to 3 story terraced housing. We've looked at low-rise apartment blocks, so between 3 and 6 story apartment blocks. And we've looked at student accommodation blocks, again in the 3 to 6 story range. I don't know if that's me doing that. We've looked at various commercial typologies as well. So low-rise workspace blocks, whether that's co-working, office space, or flexible commercial space that could potentially incorporate food and beverage and retail. Ground floor, again in the 2 to 5 story range. Workshops, so lower units that might accommodate maker space or light industrial uses, and then multi-story car parks as another typology. And we've tried to give some contemporary but good quality examples of each of those here. We've also had in the back of our minds the public realm design for the sites and around the sites. So the focus of our studies has been within the red line of each of the sites. We haven't had, as part of our work, we haven't been looking at master planning of the public realm around the sites. And I know a lot of work's been done on that, and there is a lot of interest in that. That's something that's come up repeatedly when we've presented. We've tried to produce layouts that would not hamper that and would allow that to come forward really successfully in terms of public space, routes, permeability, high quality street furniture and wayfinding, but we haven't been designing that in detail in our study. So the bulk of the work we've been carrying out started with site analysis and then an optioneering exercise on each of the 4 sites. So we produced between 6 and 10 options, I suppose, for each of the 4 sites, testing different uses and layouts to establish capacity. And those were reviewed iteratively with the project team and with the design team, taking on board all of the different criteria and trying to balance those. And of those studies, we've picked with the team 2 or 3 that we thought were the strongest to take forwards for a next iteration of design work. So this slide just illustrates a grid each of the 4 sites, just a few of the examples we've looked at and highlighted in orange with the preferred schemes from those. And really those strongest schemes were the ones that were felt to best balance the townscape and massing issues, stakeholder requirements and the site history, transport and connectivity, and provision of a mix of uses across the sites, and then of course overall commercial viability for the sites. So I'll take you briefly through the 4 sites and show you the preferred options that have come out of that process for each. This is Carfax to start with. The existing site obviously has parking at grade on it, broken up into several pieces. It's got quite a lot of trees on the site and a very informal pedestrian desire line or route across the middle of the site. So you can walk across the site currently from northwest to southeast, but it's quite difficult to do so. There are level changes. It's not a welcoming route. And is surrounded obviously with the station on one side and a mixture of residential and commercial uses. And we were very much aware of the previous scheme on the site that was brought forward to advanced level to planning by LDS and the problems that had encountered in terms of public opinion. And so in the schemes that we've developed, we've tried very deliberately to reduce the impact and massing of those. So just to highlight the changes we've made, we've reduced the overall footprint of around 17,000 square meters to approximately 13 to 14,000 square meters. We've generally reduced heights by a story across the site compared to that scheme, hence that reduction in floor area. We've looked at introducing a bigger mix of uses, including residential uses on the southern edge onto Gladstone Street. Excuse me. And we've radically reduced the amount of car parking on the site. So that scheme had around 300 spaces provided in a very large double basement car park. The preferred options that we've ended up with have between 30 and 50 spaces at ground level within one of the existing car park amongst the trees. We've also tried to break up the building mass, produce a finer grain and more modelling with narrow street frontages to be more the urban grain around the site. And then in reducing the area of footprint, we've looked at introducing more public realm area within the red line and more green space and trees being retained. So of the three options which perform best overall, we've got one very simple one, which is on the screen now, which is effectively a reduced mass version of the LDS scheme with two large commercial blocks, a smaller to the north. In all of these schemes, I should say, the registry building and the records office are retained. We felt, obviously, they bring quality, character, they're popular buildings, and the best route was to retain those. And in all of the options, the car is in the bottom right-hand corner of the site, so labelled D, the level at the area of car parking in the trees on Gladstone Street. And just in terms of numbers, the total GEA of that scheme is just under 13,000 square meters. Building heights 3 to 4 stories, so with the taller elements towards the middle of the site and held away from the adjacent neighbouring buildings. The second preferred option on the screen now introduced a diagonal route, public pedestrianised route through the middle of the site. So it's again a commercial scheme with 3 blocks varying in scale from 3 to 5 stories and modelled to break up street frontages and set down next to adjacent buildings. Again, it retains the existing car park in the trees on Gladstone Street and some of the existing silver birches in the middle of the site along that central pedestrianised diagonal route. The intent in layout and massing terms being to pick up on some of the geometry of the existing records building and give that a bit more prominence on the site than the LDS scheme had done. Excuse me. And again, that's around 13,000 square meters of commercial floor space altogether. And then we looked at two options that introduced a residential block on the southern corner. So a similar site layout to that which I've just described, but with a 3- and 4-story apartment block on Gladstone Street that we have tested as both mixed tenure housing and also as a student housing option to understand viability implications for those. We've also considered an option where you build a bit less of that so that you can't see it very well on the screen, but the right-hand end of that southern block would be removed to leave a smaller area of residential. I mean, interestingly, it may be surprising to people who haven't been through the process recently, but in viability terms, it's incredibly hard to get residential to stack up at the moment. In terms of commercial viability, it brings almost nothing to the equation, which isn't traditionally what's been the case or what people would expect. But actually, we found the more residential you added into the scheme, the worse things got from a viability point of view. So, and that's really around the point that Martin mentioned. Construction costs have gone up massively in the last 3 years. We've had sort of 20–30% increase in construction costs. Sales values and letting values haven't, they've basically stayed the same. So that's the reason for that kind of issue. And it's presenting challenges to schemes all across the country, as it has done here. So moving on to cattle market. Again, there's an existing pedestrian desire line across the site. So you do have people walking across the site currently that's not very well serviced at the moment in terms of the route and the level changes, and safety and the quality of that route. Got conditions on Andover Road and Worthy Lane in terms of the types of uses that the site faces off against, and obviously the conservation area comes up onto the Worthy Lane edge with existing residential properties there, that we were aware of in terms of responding to. So we got three options that we whittled down to show you today. The first of these is probably the most controversial in some ways, which included a large multi-level car park on the northern part of the site on Andover Road. So that would be a 4 or 5 level car park to mop up all of the existing parking on the site. And we've really tested this in viability terms to see whether there's an option that would allow you to proceed with development faster on this site. You would have potential options that you could consider, such as making that car park able to be adapted in a few years' time if Northern Park and Ride came forward and that released the site earlier. So this scheme, it's got the car park in purple at the top left of the site, and then a layout of commercial blocks onto Andover Road of 4 and 5 stories, generally getting taller towards the southern corner of the site, with a residential apartment block of 3 to 4 stories sitting on Worthy Lane. And in each of these, the assumption has been at ground floor level in the commercial and potentially the residential blocks, there would be opportunities for active commercial frontage, so food and beverage, retail, or even office type workspace at ground floor level, particularly on the more prominent corners. You know, the southern corner of Andover and Worthy Lane would be a very obvious position for that sort of stuff. And this scheme delivers around 22,000 square meters of floor area altogether, of which 6.5 is the car park. You've got around 16,000 square meters of new accommodation on the southern part. Again, we all of our options have considered retaining the existing Winchester Club. There was conversation around other options for re-providing that, but in terms of the viability overall of the site and the character and other issues, we felt it was stronger for it to be retained in the options. And the routes between the blocks at the southern part of the site would be pedestrian and cyclist only. There would be one vehicular route across the middle of the site from right to left. So cars entering off Worthy Lane, coming through the middle of the site, and then exiting and turning left onto Andover Road. And we're aware there is complexity with that, but based on the technical advice from the transport consultants, that does appear to be viable at this point. So there'd be a limited amount of parking provided to service accessible parking requirements for the residential block, and a sort of minimum of parking required for the office blocks to support the viability in each of these schemes on cattle market. So that vehicle servicing would happen off that route. Second option is a similar layout, but rather than a multi-story car park at the northern end, it's got three additional commercial blocks of 4 to 5 stories, serviced by a north-south up the right-hand side of them, between those blocks and the Winchester Club. I think the other thing I should say, in each of these schemes, we've set back the buildings several meters from the boundary red line, so that there's potential on both Andover and on Worthy Lane to widen the pavement, introduce additional street trees, particularly along Andover, and to accommodate potential changes to bus routes and cycle routes along Andover Road. So there's broader transport conversations around adding a cycle route or widening the road for bus routes there. So we've accommodated that within these layouts and areas. And again, in terms of overall areas, that's a roughly 20,000 square meters of footprint across the blocks in that scheme. Then there we go, the third option. Again, similar overall block layout with a vehicular route from east to west and a vehicular service route north-south behind those commercial blocks. But the two southern blocks in blue on the screen are tested as student accommodation blocks, so narrow footprints with courtyards within them at, again, 3 to 5 stories, so 3 stories for the blocks facing residential buildings on Worthy Lane, and then rising up to 5 stories at the corner of Andover Road and Worthy Lane. And a similar approach to setting back the frontages for pavements and street trees and road improvements. So then on the two Station East and Station West sites, starting with Station East, this was definitely the more developable and simpler proposition of these two sites. It's a bigger, squarer site, and it's less constrained by parking and vehicle requirements to some extent. There's an existing pedestrian route, informally, people walking across the car park, basically as things stand at the moment. So there's a desire line there for a public route which isn't being well serviced at the moment. It's got steeply sloping land with greenery and trees to the between the car park block and the buildings on Andover Road, which we've generally stayed away from in terms of our built form proposals, in order to retain those trees and to avoid the complexity of building on that very steep land. And we've got 2 options that came forward out of the process. So this one shows a pair of commercial blocks with starting at 3 stories on the right hand side and stepping up to 6 and 7 stories adjacent to the station. So this is the sort of tallest of any of the proposals that we looked at, with that pedestrianised public route being served by a new landscape route that would come down the east side of the site, but through a landscape space between the 2 buildings. So you'd have entrances to the north and south to those buildings off that, we would expect, and then linking to the station. So it would give the opportunity for a much higher quality, better route than exists at present, with vehicular servicing to those blocks just from the north. So there would still be cars and vehicles entering the site from the north, with a limited amount of parking and deliveries to those blocks in that location. And as I said, retaining the existing green area of trees to the south and to the east and again, in terms of footprint, that's about 10,000 square meters of accommodation altogether between those 2. And the second option is a student housing version with 3 blocks of student housing, similar approach to massing, with lower massing on the east and southern side, so 3 to 4 stories on the eastern edge and the south, and then stepping up to 5 and 6 stories in the centre and north of the site. And so in terms of typology, that would be quite a similar width and height of block as to what's already established in the student housing on the site immediately to the north of Station West. And again, a pedestrian route down the right hand side of the site, and then new landscaped courtyard spaces between the buildings to connect to the station, with vehicle servicing from the northern end. And that's a slightly smaller scheme overall, around 6,500 square meters of GEA total. And then finally on Station West, we've just got one option that we're showing today for each part of the site. As I mentioned, it's probably the most difficult site to get something workable to stack up on, partly because the providing a lot of car parking at the moment successfully is one thing. It's also got a vehicle route across the southern part of the site that provides commercial servicing to the industrial units sitting within the railway arches. It has various other constraints in terms of telephone mast at the northern end of the thin strip that needs to be serviced. And because of the proximity to residential gardens and buildings in the northern part of the site, we had to keep massing very low, between two and 3 stories on that northern narrow strip. So it's got a lot of things that make it a more challenging site to commercially to bring forward. So though we do think there is a scheme there that in time could provide some really fantastic accommodation and architecture, but it's certainly not as obvious from a development point of view of the others. So on the northern part of the site, forgive me, north is to the left on this scheme in order to get the drawing on. The option, the preferred option that came out of the testing was a long linear series of 2 and 3 story workshop or commercial units that would be serviced by a roadway on the east hand side of them, so next to the tracks, that would also provide access up to the phone mast at the northern end of the site, which needs to be maintained, and then have some loading bay and parking space between each of those commercial. And I think we saw those as being potentially a mixture of small scale makerspace, workshop space, and studio accommodation, so flexible commercial uses within those units. And obviously, the heights being modelled to avoid overshadowing or privacy issues with the neighbouring residential gardens and so on, and to avoid infringing tree canopies along that route. And then on the Station West South, on the southern part of that site, the preferred option that came out of the testing on that side is a residential apartment block scheme, so a chain of 3 to 4 story blocks that would have pedestrianised entrances on the north side, so at the top of the bank, effectively along Stockbridge Road, would be pedestrian entrances to those blocks, and then a limited amount of parking and vehicle access being maintained on the other side of those blocks, on the southern side, so that you'd continue to allow vehicle access through to the car park in the northern section and the industrial units next to the railway. Being careful in massing terms to stay away from the existing office block that sits immediately to the south of the site. So putting our roadway on that side helps that as well. And again, just numerically, that's something like 7,400 square meters of floor space altogether being provided. So I think that brings me to the end of taking you through the work that's been done to date. There's been viability appraisal work done on each of the schemes to help whittle them down, and then iteratively as the designs have been brought forwards. And I think overall, just conclude by sort of reiterating what has been said already, which is that all of the sites offer fantastic opportunities for schemes. It's quite challenging currently in viability terms. We've had to, in each case, push the mass really as far as we think we can within the bounds of providing good quality, sensitive urban planning to try and support that viability and help them look as commercially attractive as possible. So very much looking forward to the next stage of the process to support the council in whatever scheme comes forward and help bring the whole thing forwards. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed, Hugo. Ms. Taylor, are we going to talk about, there are some other papers involved. Will we talk about those in detail, or shall we just ask questions about them based on having read them?
No, if we just take questions, that'll be fine.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Wallace, I believe you want to make or say a few words about this paper.
Thank you, Chair. I'm excited about this project. Station Approach is the gateway to our fantastic city and a hub for people travelling in and out of the area. Therefore, the development of Station Approach is a great opportunity to accelerate the transition of Winchester into a more environmentally friendly and sustainable city. However, rather than this opportunity being reflected in the report appears to adopt a business as usual approach with any passing acknowledgement of the climate emergency. As you know, traffic is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions in the district. Hampshire County Council have concluded that switching to zero emission vehicles will not get emissions reduced quickly enough, and so have set a draft goal of reducing traffic by 10% by 2030. However, reducing traffic barely gets mentioned in the report. Page after page is dedicated to how cars are managed, not reducing the amount of traffic, simply moving it from one car park to another. At the back of the report, on page 230, results from a user intercept survey showed that 54% of respondents would consider leaving their car at home if bus services were more frequent and more reliable. Wouldn't that be fantastic? Imagine if we could halve the number of cars in the city centre and the impact that would make on quality of life in the city. Not only that, but another 9% would consider leaving their car at home if there was improved cycling and walking infrastructure. This project on its own cannot solve all of those challenges, but it can and should help to move alternative travel opportunities forward. Station Approach is a transport hub for our city and should be at the centre of our active travel infrastructure. So rather than trying to develop a plan which does nothing to improve the traffic situation in the city, more effort needs to be focused on how we can use a Station Approach development to improve the alternative travel methods. It's not just on transport that the report appears to skip over climate emergency issues. The typology of buildings used for the study appears to follow a business as usual approach. The National Model Design Code recommends that passive design and building orientation are considered at the earliest planning stages to ensure optimum energy efficiency. Whilst more detailed analysis will come later, the layout and orientation of new buildings contributes to reducing their energy needs by avoiding overshadowing, maximising passive solar gain, internal daylight levels and ventilation, so need to be considered at the earliest stage. These issues are important as we move towards building more efficient, energy efficient properties. I hope that you will consider these suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Wallace. I think your comments are all well made, but they relate to a different paper and a different meeting. So the movement strategy in Winchester is the paper and the policy that determines how we're going to sort out movement. And the master planning process is the process which follows on from the capacity study to answer the question as to all the questions you talked about, such as questions like solar gain and how exactly the wider public realm in the area of the station would be developed in order to support the kind of transport transition that you're talking about. At a time when councils around the country are being taken over by central government because of their financial mismanagement, this is actually an incredibly important stage in the process, which makes sure that we're able to do anything in a way that is financially prudent and reflects the realities of the financial situation of local government. So it is it is a vital step to say, are we able to do anything in a way that we can afford? Because, as you rightly say, we do have to put financial priority into tackling the climate emergency and movement, and are doing so through the movement strategy. And we have to think about environmental considerations, particularly in the master planning process, which this is not. This is a precursor to the master planning process. It's very much focused on, are we, as a financially prudent organisation, able to do anything at Station Approach in the current context of rapid inflation, high interest rates, explosion in cost? Is there any kind of plausible financial scenario which would enable us to do any kind of development at all? Which is what we asked Mr. Braddock to answer for us. And that is the purpose of the presentation today. So it is, we have deliberately constructed this process as a staged process. So what we did not want to do was to charge off after a project and then discover we'd come up with something that we couldn't afford to do. The purpose of this process is to carefully start by saying, what are the objectives that we're talking about? And the objectives that have been backed by the public and have been confirmed through this process explicitly raise the need to transition to low carbon transport and the role of this site as a low carbon transport hub. They have been confirmed, and then we say, have we got something here that is a realistic project in the current time, in the current context, that we can use as a start point for achieving those wider objectives? So there will be a paper coming in July which will precisely talk about what is the financial situation we're in, and what is the journey forward in order to achieve the kind of objectives that you have highlighted. But this is not that paper, and that is not the decision of the information in front of us today. I don't know if Mr. East or Ms. Taylor wants to add any further perspective on the process that we're going through, and whether I've correctly summarised it, wearing my cabinet member hat as opposed to my chair of the meeting hat.
I think you've summarised it brilliantly. Nothing to add in terms of the process. Just like to say I agree with all the comments that Councillor Wallace has made. Station Approach is a fantastic opportunity. It's a gateway to the city. We know from the stakeholder engagement that we undertook that this is what's come out from our discussions. You know, when you come out of the station, this is Winchester, and does it reflect what we want Winchester to be, and how can we improve that? But that is for the master planning process to design that out. It's certainly a sustainable location, and we should be doing everything we can to minimise car traffic and reduce traffic through the area. But we'll be working with Hampshire County Council to implement the measures set out in the movement strategy, and we wouldn't be doing anything in the Station Approach area in the master planning to preclude that development, but that is all for later stages, as Councillor Todd has outlined.
Confirmed, for example, in the discussions about improving the walking and cycling route plans that are planned for Worthy Road and discussed for Andover Road, the extra bus priority measures in Andover Road, those kind of discussions have been factored into the work that we've done.
And they have, yes, and we've got Hampshire County Council as a member of our project board and in close liaison with them throughout the whole process, and that will continue.
Thank you very much. Mr. East.
Yes, just to add, Chair, in terms of viability, the need to be forward thinking, and particularly around net zero carbon and how one would achieve that, has been factored into the build costs as part of the viability study. So let me assure the council that this is not business as usual. Actually, again, part of the thinking in terms of is there a potential viable scheme is actually thinking about what the council and what Winchester will need in the years moving forward, and in particular in relation to the climate emergency and moving towards the council's target for addressing climate emergency.
That is very useful confirmation. So we have factored in the cost that it takes to achieve our environmental objectives into the capacity study process, because again, if we weren't to do that, the risk is that we would start working on the project and then run into the wall of the fact that we couldn't afford to achieve the objectives that we have. So we have done it in such a way that is consistent with our policies and our intentions in terms of net zero. That's very reassuring. Thank you very much indeed. Good. And thank you, Councillor Wallace, for your deputation. Colleagues, Councillor Bolton, you're quick off the mark. Questions, I think, first we'll go with. So if you have any questions for clarification, areas you'd like to explore further, please fire away.
Thank you, Chair. It's because it's on that exact point, actually, was one of my questions for Hugo, was about the viability. I'd love to understand a little bit about what tolerances there are within calculating that viability for these types of schemes. Because over the last 12 months, we've seen, as you quite rightly point out, two big things have been moving a lot. One is residential letting prices at not moving much or not enough, and inflation moving way more than any of us would like. I wonder, therefore, in a project, as long as this will take to deliver, how you work within certain tolerances to maintain viability at every point along that way. Because at some point, if we have another episode of, you know, double-digit inflation over a couple of years, things start to fall apart, one would imagine. Maybe I'll let you answer that, and then if I can ask my second question off that, that'd be great.
That's actually fine.
Yeah, it's a complex one to answer in some ways. So because you're sort of building in contingency or tolerance or risk in various ways on those costs, but trying to do so in such a way that doesn't give you a completely uninformative answer at the get-go, I suppose. So, I mean, one example is which is around that issue, is sometimes referred to as sensitivity analysis. So we tested within the viability appraisals a range of affordable housing percentages in the residential schemes. So we basically started with 50% and modelled 35 and 25% to compare on that. It was felt that there was no way it was feasible to drop below those levels, but so that type of sensitivity testing to see what impact those would have on schemes that came forward was carried out. There are inflation and contingency figures built into the assessment, so you know we in the project team are relying on the viability experts, LSH, to advise in terms of forecasting on what the appropriate figures to include for those are. So I suppose, put bluntly, if something wildly unexpected happened globally, you know, there's another thing like COVID, you probably can't really plan for that. But within the realms of what you can feasibly plan for, we try to sort of build those figures in, and that's fairly standard practice in these sorts of appraisals. I don't know if John, you'd have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I think in words know who LSH are there, that's Lambert Smith Hampton. So we used not just them, but also our advisor JLL to assist us with some early analysis. But these are, in the nicest possible way, hard-nosed commercial operators, frankly, who are going to tell you, you know, not quite the doom and gloom case, but they're not going to be, there's not much hope there. They'll tell it how it is in terms of the build cost and the market scenario, which has been a good thing, because that's what we wanted. We actually want to start from a position of reality, not from a position of optimism and hope, you know, which sometimes happens in the past, you know, or has not necessarily in Winchester, but, you know, it is something, a trap one can fall into. So I think they've been very clear in terms of where they see the build costs, the reason for the build costs having escalated, where they see the rental market, and again, the reasoning as to what values in terms of rentals which could be achieved, and they, you know, have been conservative with a small c in terms of those. So we start from a position, I think, of, you know, not optimism biased, but actually some degree of reality. As Hugo said, moving forward, I mean, I think what we're being told by our advisors is that the market, in terms of, particularly in terms of build costs, is starting to stabilise. And that, of course, is not a Winchester issue; it's all right across the board. But of course, the one thing we can't do, and you wouldn't expect us to be able to do, is to account for further, you know, how can I put it, very unnatural events, which, dare I say, wouldn't just have an impact on Winchester, but would have an impact throughout the country.
Just to add to that, I mean, the whole design and development process is obviously very iterative, and within each stage of, you know, the RIBA plan of work that you work through, from master plan through to delivery, there will be, you would expect there to be iterative cost plans, viability appraisals, and most big projects that take a number of years go through shifts in that time. That's actually very normal. So I think you just have to accept that you try and make the very best assessment that you can now, building in the right level of caution and optimism to give yourself a range, and then you have to be prepared to continually work to make it work as you go through, really.
Sorry, as a follow-up to that, does that effectively mean that while we have, and John is right in terms of the assumptions, some very hard-headed assumptions, some of which we would disagree with, in terms of, you know, the classic one being, every time you talk industry, they say if you don't have tons of car parking, then your rent collapses. And we've not overruled them on that. We've said we need to get through that particular gate. I suppose my question would be, firstly, actually a clarification where it's useful to have an outside voice in terms of the points that were made by Councillor Wallace about things like alignments and carbon technologies and carbon reduction and the wider master planning work to help support the work to support active travel and cut carbon. Is that the kind of thing that can happen at the next stage? And I suppose the other question is, if the financial situation improves in terms of the development industry or the construction world, does that mean that a master planning process could actually find that it has more options as we move further down the road?
Yeah, that is the case. And I think for any one of the 4 sites, you wouldn't necessarily expect, you know, whoever comes in to design it and master plan it and take it forwards, you wouldn't necessarily expect that the footprint and layout of the blocks that is developed and comes forward is the same as any one of that we have. We're trying to test a feasible range of massing that we think is viable, that achieves a good level of floor space on the site in ways that, you know, meet all of the parameters. So they might do, but certainly that could change and develop as you go forwards. And yet, economic parameters could change. You know, obvious one is sale values and or rental values might go up in a way that's that they're not doing at the moment. I mean, that's a classic. You know, development and future gazing is a complicated, tricky business, and actually a lot of developers go into a scheme assuming one level of commercial viability or profit, and they find that the residential market has moved in a way positively much more than they thought it would, and you know, that changes what options you have potentially as you go through, or might change your options for how you deliver the site. And there's a whole conversation about delivery, you know, how much profit margin, for example, you might look for within any delivery model, that is almost separate to the design issue. You know, do you do a JV with a development partner who is looking for a commercial profit, or is there an opportunity for Winchester to self-fund and self-develop, which might accept a lower profit margin and give you more options? So I hope that answers the question, Martin.
That's very helpful, thank you. And John?
I think, just without wishing to obviously labour the point, but I think one other aspect which we need just to recall is it's a stage-by-stage, step-by-step process. So we've got a cabinet report going in July, where cabinet will need to make a decision as to whether they want to proceed with this project. If they do, officers' recommendation will be to undertake a concept master plan, which will start to address some of the points which Councillor Wallace's points. only once that master plan has been approved, or again by cabinet, will the council decide to undertake a outline business case. And at that point, they will then decide which would be the appropriate mechanism if the scheme remains viable to take forward any proposals. So I think the bit which I want to reassure members is, as I said, it is very much an iterative process, and there's some way to go. But within, two constants for me, or three constants, are ensuring there's a scheme which actually meets the requirements, needs, and approval of the community, number one, and addresses the community's priorities. Number two, a scheme which actually would create or will create a design and development which is worthy of Winchester and absolutely recognises the very special characteristics which Winchester has, and also addresses some of the issues which arose in the past. And thirdly, a scheme, goes without saying, which actually is viable. And
Thank you. That's a very helpful clarification. Councillor Godfrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to Councillor Wallace's presentation, while I might not go as far as to say you'd answered it brilliantly, I would grudgingly admit that I tend to agree to the way you've described the scope of this project. But I think I would welcome clarification about the purpose of this capacity study. We heard about the 4 different sites and how they could be made viable with certain developments on. But we heard several months ago that Network Rail and train operators were not willing to give up the existing car parking spaces, and yet the capacity study does not have an option for retaining the 600 car parking spaces and still do additional development on, which may be or may not be viable in terms of a capacity assessment. So should we have that assessment on those 2 rail sites, or is it no longer relevant? And it then comes on to what is it we're trying to achieve as a city council on the 2 sites that we own. If we're not trying to achieve the most viable, the most profitable options, what are we trying to achieve? What is the strategic outcome? Is it to make the best quality, the prettiest, the most housing, the most employment opportunities? How will we know that the assessed viability of a scheme, we've done what we want to assess within the capacity study?
I think that's, I mean, the objectives of what we're trying to achieve, we've laid out in. I think, well, I don't know if John or Emma wishes to.
In terms of the purpose of the capacity study, as we set out at the outline, it's purely to see whether there's a viable scheme in commercial terms at this point in time that we could then look to see how we could develop a project further. No more than that. We've seen across the 4 sites within Station Approach that there is development opportunities that could be taken forward on the 4 sites. But when you apply the current development appraisals to those sites, currently it's only the Carfax and Cattle Market site that come out with a positive residual land value, which would indicate that there is a viable scheme that we could investigate further. The reason that the Network Rail sites don't look viable at the moment is because of the policy that Network Rail have, and that's not just a Winchester policy, it's a policy right across the country that they would replace any of their car parking 1-for-1. We did look at the opportunity of whether, as Hugo outlined, we could put a multi-storey car park on Cattle Market that would then relocate some of the Network Rail parking to that site. But in terms of Network Rail's policy, they are customer first. They are looking at close proximity of parking to the railway station, so that wouldn't work for them at the moment. I think the key is when we're looking at the station approach project, we're not just looking at what is viable today. We need to take that longer term approach, and a master plan would have a sort of a 10-year lifespan, if you like. So it is possible that the Network Rail sites could come forward at a later date if the policy changes within Network Rail, which is a possibility as there is reduction in cars, or in terms of the economic climate changing. So I think in terms of viability terms and what we're getting out of the capacity study, it's clearly done its purpose in terms of indicating to us that we could take the next step forward.
Thank you. And sort of slightly to build on that point, one of the purposes of the capacity study was presumably to flush out the constraints that we're operating under, in the sense that what it's done on two levels is, one is it's actually crystallised this, I'm not sure if it's Network Rail or the Office for the Rail Regulator or the Office for Road and Rail or whatever it's called, policy that says they have to keep current car parking levels next to the station, which is useful to know. It wasn't as clear as we thought it was at the beginning. And then the realization that if you do that, then you have huge viability problems. And I suppose the second thing it highlighted was that through the parking studies is that if you can take out Gladstone Street, but you can't take out the Cattle Market without knocking over the Carfax Junction, sending lots of cars around the one-way system, adding to congestion, pollution, poor air quality, etc., which is why we ended up, which is actually really helpful because we had made judgments about sequencing and other such questions before, but I don't think we'd had it as explicitly linked to the movement strategy as we did before. Is that a fair understanding?
Yes, Councillor.
Good. Councillor Cremoyson.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to go back around to the viability modelling. I'm assuming that you have a model and you have there's some standards around how you build a model for this. It's not just invented by a couple of individuals. There's some standards there around how a local authority should be modelling viability built into it. I'm assuming that's the case, so correct me if I'm wrong on that. I understand the issues around, we've had substantial inflation around the construction industry. There's all sorts of things going on in the rental market and the housing market. So those things may not all have caught up. But I wonder with this, I'm almost sort of getting the impression that the point here is to say whether there is or isn't a viable scheme. And at this stage, we're not trying to predetermine what the outcomes are. So when we've been talking in your modelling, you're talking about the most viable one seems to be involving student accommodation. That happens to be what it is now. But if you ran the model in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, under different circumstances with different assumptions, it might be that residential might then be more viable. I'm just sort of looking for you to confirm in a minute. So I guess what we're doing here is just making sure there is a viable option going forward, because if there wasn't, that would be important information for Cabinet to understand, to say, do we or do we not continue to spend money on this project? But you're not at this stage, I think, trying to predetermine that it will be necessarily student accommodation in some of those locations. Is that correct?
Yes, Councillor, that's correct. The approach that the cost consultants have undertaken in producing the model is standard industry modelling for schemes based on residual land value. So what the model is, in simple terms, they look at the development value for the site for that particular use, and then they deduct from that all the development costs. So that would be build costs, it would include profit, it would include contingency, it would include allowances for SIL and any abnormal costs. And then the amount that is left over is the residual land value figure. And if it's a positive figure, then it's deemed to be in commercially viable terms if you can afford to pay for the land with that amount of money that's left over. In terms of the council's modelling, if we were to take the project forward, that is another appraisal that would be undertaken, which the council would say, is the scheme affordable to the council? And that would not only depend on the development value and development costs, but it would also be attributed to the actual delivery model. So that could be a joint venture relationship, like we've done similar with CWR. It could be self-development for the council, and we would go through all of those different options to see what would be the most affordable for the council and the most preferable for the council to deliver. But at this moment in time, it's purely a commercial development appraisal based on the options that we've looked at in the capacity study, and it does not predetermine the final use of the scheme.
That's very helpful. Do you, one more quick one, because we have quite a lot to get through still, but
Hugo, it's on for you again. It was following on from actually all of those points in a way that it became quite clear in the presentation and in the document that I read that the public realm experience was under a lot of pressure because of trying to make the scheme viable in terms of the commercial and residential property and all that sort of thing. I wonder, I've seen some amazing sort of schemes abroad where they've taken that public realm green experience and they've placed it on top of the buildings. So greening and making garden areas, connecting the rooftops to enhance the experience and create a more commercial opportunity for a garden experience within a city. And at the end of the day, one of the things that makes city life, it enhances city life, is where you have lovely green spaces. I wonder if there was any consideration given to any of that, whether it could be given, and how that impacts the viability. Thank you, Chair.
So I guess there's a couple of separate things there. I think, as I said, we our focus of our study has been within the red line on the site, so we haven't been really looking at or designing the public realm that happens beyond that. And obviously there's a whole world of potential improvements that could go on around the public realm of Winchester generally, and quite a lot of design work and master planning work that's been done on those already in different forms. So with regard to the public realm outside of the sites, I think we were mainly concerned with trying not to do anything that would make those difficult to deliver or impact on those in terms of pavement width, street trees. In terms of the public realm within the site, I think within each of the, I mean, you said that the public realm's been squeezed by the development, and I suppose we haven't on any of the sites proposed a sort of large public square or a new park, and you know that is primarily driven by the requirement for one of those is not an explicit part of the brief, I suppose. You know, from the brief from Winchester isn't we must have a new football pitch here. It's about trying to find viable, and to do with the viability. You know, viability is challenging if there was scope to go really tall without causing problems, or if there was, I suppose, you know, more obvious massive profits in the schemes generally, then you might start looking at bigger open spaces potentially. But I think from an urban design and urban realm point of view, we're fairly confident that the widths of streets and routes and pockets of public space within each of the sites would allow really significant improvement of public realm within the sites. You know, it's they're not those at the moment as providing parks or squares, but there's room for really good high quality public realm within them, and that permeability and legibility and wayfinding, so people being able to move across sites well, and that being a good experience and it being safe and so on. I mean, that's one of the biggest single gains that some of the sites could offer, I think, in terms of public realm. So in terms of whether or not that could include green landscape on top of buildings, we haven't really got into that level of design. My instinct is the sites don't really offer themselves to that being done really successfully and viably. I mean, it's possible that within cattle market, where there are quite big level changes across the site, you might be able to incorporate areas of accommodation that you're walking on top of that sit within the flow of the public spaces within that site, and that would be something that would be explored at the next stage of design on those sites. But I think certainly for Carfax and the two station sites, it will be harder to imagine that being something that was viable and successful on those sites, I think. I mean, to go back to your previous point, Councillor Godfrey's point, what's the purpose of the whole thing? Like, what are the key aims, and how's that steering our choice of uses, really? I think the appraisal has been deliberately open-ended to test different uses. So we haven't had a brief from the council. It must have this much housing, or it must. So the aim has been to test a range to see what opportunities there are on each of the sites. But I think the overarching aim of all of them is to make Winchester a better place. I mean, that's the purpose in a sense from everybody's point of view. So all those overriding development principles about sustainable development, transport, permeability, travel, and so on. You know, that's what each of the four sites has got really good potential to offer, improving the public realm and public experience of Winchester. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer, but I'd say in terms of the greening on rooftops, that hasn't been explored in this study, and it seems less likely to me in these instances. But major improvements to public realm in each case would be a definite for each of the sites.
Thank you very much. So I don't know if there are any more. I don't see any hands for any more questions on the non-exempt bit of the paper. The exempt bit of the paper will be examined. Quite an English word. Will be examined again as part of the strategic outline case process. I think it would be, so it will come back to us again as part of the cabinet paper where we decide whether to go through the next gate. But this is a chance, if you want to interrogate that, ask some questions about it, to do so. But it would mean that we move into exempt session. I'm not seeing huge energy for that.
Clarify, Mr. Chairman. The information in the exempt is bare for comparative purposes to support the capacity study.
Yes.
Is that correct? They're not the information that we will be considering at the next stage, which would be
So
more
it's not
specific.
Yeah, it's not the outline business case. As I understand it, it's an independent assessment of the values that sit behind the capacity study. So it is an independent consultant's view to say the residual value for each of the options that Hugo and his team have pulled together as for evaluation is as follows, and it gives us that extra perspective to show where we have a positive land value and where we don't in terms of the proposals that are put forward. John?
Chair, you're absolutely correct. This is to assist you as members in whether you wish to take this project forward. That goes without saying. If you do, there will be continued viability testing throughout the process, but the outline business case, is considerable way off in the nicest possible way, and would only start to be undertaken once there is, effectively a viable master plan, which you as members will have been able to have considered.
So something that I think we've all had a chance to check from reading the papers. So this will inform the strategic outline case, which is what we'll be talking about in July.
Okay.
And I suppose the thing that I wanted reassurance on when I read it, which I don't think we necessarily need to discuss in public, well, in exempt session, because it would mean throwing everybody out and bring them back in again, is are the assumptions suitably pessimistic? Are they realistic? Are they saying things where you're going, I really wish you'd let us charge a premium on the rent for having a high environmental quality building and other such things? And the answer is they're not. But actually that's useful so that we know how conservative with a small c, as John East put it earlier, the financial assumptions are, and have that reassurance. So I suggest I'm not going to move to exempt unless anybody else wants to, and I'm not seeing that from anybody. I think that's been I don't know if people want to, the recommendations we have in front of us are that we note the outcome of the capacity study and agree that there should be a report based on the capacity study as without strategic outline case, setting out options as to how we go forward from here. I don't know if people want to debate those conclusions or what they've heard in the strategic outline case. I think we've had quite a good exploration of the issues. So I suggest then that we move to the recommendations, which is noting the outcome of the capacity study, indicating that there are currently opportunities to bring and doesn't have the words despite the grim environment for development projects at the moment, or the challenging situation for development projects, to bring forward a potentially viable scheme. Agree that a further report will be submitted to a future cabinet later this year, incorporating the conclusions of the capacity study and other technical works into a strategic outline case, setting out options for how the project would be developed. And then one I would add informally, which we won't add to the minutes, which is to thank Hugo and his team for the great work they've really done on behalf of the council and the officers working with them to help us sort through the complexity of the situation we're in and bring much valued and needed clarity in terms of where we stand at this stage of the project. Cabinet colleagues, you're the only ones who have a vote on this because of the way the Constitution works. Are you agreed with those recommendations?
Agreed.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Emma and Hugo, for in particular, but also all of your colleagues for the great amount of work that you've done on this and the insight and imagination you've brought to a challenging project. It's much appreciated. We now move on to the next item of the agenda, which is an update from Dawn Adey, John East, and John Norden, who's the creative director of Jigsaw, on Central Winchester Regeneration, where we are and what's due to happen next.
Good. Well, thank you, Chair. And if you recall, through the approved governance process, which was agreed, back in February, I think it was, we agreed that we would be bringing up updates to the Regeneration Cabinet Committee every quarter. So this is the first, dare I say it, update which we're providing you with since the development partner was appointed and announced. And of course, you may not recall, I mean, you reminded us that the last Region Cabinet Committee was on the 9th of March, by which time we had our Cabinet meeting on the 6th of March, where it had been agreed to appoint the development partner, but we weren't able to announce that development partner because we had the sort of 10-day standstill period whereby other unsuccessful bidders could challenge the council on the decision making. Glad to say, obviously, they didn't. So this will be the first time that we're able to introduce this committee to our approved partner, who are effectively a consortium made up of, I suppose, 2 joint venture partners. So 4 developers in total. One being, I suppose, shortened to PIGLU, which is PFP Capital and Igloo, and the other joint venture being JKRL, who are a joint venture of Kojima and Regenerate, who have come together to form one joint venture called Jigsaw. Well, that's a shortened name, Jigsaw, people for places or places for people. So they were announced to the public towards the end of March, and then we went into PERDA. But I'm obviously very pleased to have with me John Norden from Jigsaw. He's going to talk a little bit later about the draft stakeholder engagement plan. But just to say that this consortium of 4 developers brings together 4 very experienced developers as our development partner, who have, dare I say it, a very good track record. Each of them has a good track record and have the right experience for Winchester, but they also have, dare I say, different but complementary skills. So John's no doubt going to say a little bit more about that. So since PERDA, of course, we then had to go into sort of some degree of silence. We've been working hard with our new partner on the draft development agreement. We've made good progress. There are 1 or 2 issues which we're now at this point in time finalising, but we expect within the next week to have finalised those remaining points. And the intention is that starting from 28th of June, the 4 partners or members of the consortium will then go to their respective boards to get their sign-off on the finalised development agreement, with the intention that the final piece in Jigsaw as part of getting the development agreement signed, at least from the development partner side, will be going to Kojima, Japan, with the intention that they get their board sign-off before the end of July, at which point we will then sign the finalised development agreement. So that should be signed by ourselves and our partners before the end of July, and then the formal process in terms of preparing the delivery plan, getting the board meetings started and kicking off commences. So the real business will then start from there. But in the meantime, both ourselves and the council have been undertaking a lot of work, and of course John will say a little bit more about the work which Jigsaw have been doing, and particularly around stakeholder engagement. In terms of archaeology, as I think we've reported to this committee in the past, we are proposing, and there's been agreed, a further process of trial trenching. So that's going to commence on Basket Yard in July. The appointed contractors will be on site from the 3rd of July, and that will be a 4-month project with public engagement throughout. So further trial digs. We're currently organising an open archaeology day for everyone who's interested towards the end of July, where the archaeologists will be on site explaining the process of the digs and how they're going to be sharing the information which comes forward. And they'll also provide an update on the work which universities have undertaken, and particularly the carbon dating from earlier trial boreholes. Members may note that work has started on King's Walk to undertake further improvements to the ground floor of King's Walk. That was granted planning permission and work commenced on site a couple of weeks ago, and that's a 10 or 12-week contract to effectively create a better visual environment in terms, particularly in terms of the courtyard, rationalising of signage and making general improvements which have had sign off from both the council in terms of getting planning permission, but also secured the support of the existing occupiers of the ground floor. And indeed, we've been in dialogue with Jigsaw, who to ensure that these proposals fit in with their emerging or developing ideas for King's Walk and beyond, and they do. So you will hopefully start the next 2 or 3 months to see further, sort of enhancements of King's Walk, which, dare I say it, given where we were 2 or 3 years ago and where it is now, it is in a rather different place. I'm also pleased to say that on the 24th of May, we secured planning permission for the demolition of Friarsgate Medical Centre, with proposals that following demolition, the site would comprise an archaeological dig area to enable us to further de-risk the early phases and part of the wider Central Winchester project, but also, of course, to give us much better information in terms of what has lain beneath the ground for hundreds of years, and also associated with that a pop-up park. And demolition will, we hope, commence in early autumn, following having secured the back licenses. And for those that will remember the history we've gone through as Pat's in the building, so obviously we have had to both secure the necessary and quite proper remedial actions to but before we could undertake any demolition works, and as part of that, of course, is securing, making sure we've got our back licenses. So again, over the coming months, you'll start to see actually things actively happening within the area. I think the final thing which we've been doing since the development partners have appointed has been working with Jigsaw on developing their, or helping them with the development of the draft stakeholder engagement plan. So John's going to say more, but there have been discussions already, early discussions behind the scenes with potential partners. But part of today is really, I think, for John to secure what they're proposing and to get your input into their proposals. So with that, I will hand over to John.
Thank you, John. Well, matching glasses, so it's quite nice, isn't it? I'll try and stay close to this microphone. God, really excited to be here today at the start of what is going to be a fantastic process, I hope. Our stated aim, as made clear a couple of months ago when we were first introduced to the public, was to listen, and that 6-month listening process starts, as John says, on sort of signing of the development agreement. But we have been listening already, and I'm going to take you through what we've been up to the last couple of months and what the plan is for that 6-month period. Although it sounds like John's also opened me up to take questions on other things, which thanks for that. I'll do my best. There's a lag on this. And go old school and use the buttons. It's easier. So first of all, I just wanted to talk you through the process that we're looking at. I'm going to talk you through what I've called the pyramid of consensus building. We're starting, as again I said before, with a fantastic document, which is the SPD, which went through an extensive public engagement process. However, it was 2018, it was pre-COVID. We want to check, measure, is that still where we are? Has anything else emerged or any other trends appearing? And we want to be able to take the opportunity to take those things on board. We've been having, over the last 2 months, informal meetings with officers of the council. So we met with Winchester County Council and Winchester and Hampshire County Council on highways on the movement strategy. We've met around housing, around grants, and planning. So we've just been sort of building those relationships. We made a presentation of our approach to 250 members of the council officers who all joined online, which was fantastic. And from that, lots of people saying, oh yeah, we're doing this in our department, we can help you do that. So again, there's so much latent capacity within the council already. We don't need to employ people from the outside to come in to do things. We can deploy the help and skills that we've got within the council itself. We've been talking to a few residents via organisations such as the Winchester Cycle Campaign, WINAC, and those sorts of groups, just again informally, just sort of getting a feel for their concerns. I had a nice bike ride around Winchester with the cycle groups and businesses, and mostly the businesses we've been talking to are the people who are within the red line, so King's Walk tenants, but also conversations with Marks and Spencers and the Brooks in order to understand what they're trying to achieve. So we're just getting ourselves out there informally to start with, building those relationships. And again, it's an open invite. Anybody who wants to speak to us, just let us know. We do have a list at the moment of people we haven't got round to yet, and we'll do that in quite an informal way. But you know, once the development agreement is signed, we'll get into a much more formal process. So the next tier of consensus building sees us launch Commonplace, which is our digital platform, which reaches many more people than we can do face to face, and that's a great way of contacting other audiences who maybe don't have the time to come and see us. We're going to set up a series of regular drop-ins with the public, and they will be not just in Winchester, but we want to do some of those out in the villages, because we know the issue of getting people out their cars and into public transport relies upon understanding what the needs and pressures are out there. We then will have much more strategic meetings with officers, starting to drill down into detail, and then we will present our initial scoping and stakeholder plan, or rather I am now introducing our initial stakeholder plan to this group today, to sort of give you a feel for our approach. So that's the 7th of June date, which I think is today. The next tier, which will be probably in July, we will look at hosting what I've called 4 themed stakeholder workshops. So they will be, I do have them written down somewhere, but I haven't got them to hand, but it doesn't really matter, because to some degree we will shape those to what we're hearing from the engagement. But one will probably be around business, one will be around movement, one will be around culture and heritage, and the 4th to be decided. But they are themed because we want to bring together experts and interested parties in those subject matters to kind of flush out, are we all on the same page, and if we're not, what are the tension points around those particular things, before we start looking at sort of what development does really, which is resolving cross-thematic issues. So the conflicts between, say, what movement wants to do and maybe what archaeology or heritage wants to do, for example, or what placemaking wants to do and movement and those things, and how we resolve and bring those things together. So in July, we'll have these 4 themed stakeholder workshops. We'll feed back everything we discover from those via Commonplace. So that opens it back up to the public for them to be able to comment on that. We can sort of stress test what comes out of those workshops. We will continue to refresh what we call the meanwhile use, which at the moment, I guess, is what the way King's Walk is operating. It was seen as a meanwhile activity, but actually talking to the tenants there without wanting to speak out of turn, it just feels like something fantastic we want to nurture. And how do we turn meanwhile into all while? How do we actually keep those thriving businesses there and help and support them? And I think because the council already committed to investing some monies into it, as John alluded to, we don't really want to then waste that. So we want to keep building on that. That's our current thinking. Critically, we want to try and to establish two groups, what we call a youth group and a futures group. A youth group of younger people who perhaps haven't been given an opportunity before to really engage in the process. And we can see from the existing stakeholder work the council have done, they've done an awful lot, but never really got into the schools. So I think we see it as a great opportunity to get into the schools and form that youth group. And the futures group will be in a sense, a self-selected group of people from across Winchester who are our kind of sounding board. So we need somebody from each of the, the Winchester Trust, the WINAC, those kinds of organisations that can then help us kind of take the ideas and thoughts that we generate together back through to their organisations and ask those questions, because we need to actually unlock the capacity we've got to communicate between all of us, rather than it all being a bottleneck and coming just through us. Obviously, we need to take it and craft it and shape it into something, but we really need the help of those groups in Winchester to reach as many people as possible. We'll continue with the drop-in sessions through July and all through the summer, and we'll present the initial outputs from that work, from those stakeholder workshops, the futures and youth groups, to the 4th of October Cabinet Committee for Regeneration. We then see stage 4 being after the summer, because we don't want anybody to feel excluded, because we arranged some significant activity over the summer period to do a series of what we call co-creation workshops. So this is where we start really mixing up all the themes. So we hopefully resolve some of the conflict that might exist in the silo, so around transport, and having a kind of shared understanding of what kind of, to the points that have been talked about before in terms of movement, in relation to the Central Winchester Regeneration site. However, we're well aware that, I think, as the council's partner on this, we have an obligation to also help engage on the wider movement strategy, because we know that in isolation, we're not going to solve all the problems, just as you've heard on the station. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us to get involved in helping with that, and we'll give whatever support the council wants us to make sure that it works as a whole system. But the co-creation workshops will actually be cross-thematic, so we start to get people from those themed workshops mixed up and really starting to help us vision for what place we want to create, which would basically be sort of standing on the shoulders, we hope, of the SPD, taking it a little bit further and really helping us create our brief. And remember, in all of this time, we're not designing, we are listening, we are absorbing, we are shaping our brief and making sure that our facts are correct before we then move into a design phase. And again, all of the outputs from those co-creation sessions will be made available on Commonplace. The final step in the engagement plan in the first 6 months, so this is up to the stage where we are obliged after 6 months of signing our development agreement to deliver what's called a development delivery plan. We want to present the outcomes of the stakeholder engagement process. So effectively, we can bake in the stakeholder engagement into that development delivery plan and make sure our brief for what we go forward and deliver is completely aligned with the wishes of all of the people we've worked with over that 6-month period. And then we can start designing something that, when people see it, they go, oh, I recognise that. Oh yeah, that's something that we talked about and asked for. And we're working, in a very shared and common way. So we see that piece of work being presented in the January Cabinet Committee meeting for Regeneration. In terms of stakeholders, we have a long list of which I'm not going to name them all, but I'm just going to go almost by cohort, if that's the right terminology. So just building them up. We've obviously got, and I've spoken about some of these already, Winchester County Council and various other statutory bodies, which we, you know, through the planning process have to deal with, but it's not have to. It's kind of, like I said, there's lots of latent skills within those organisations that we can work with and embrace. There's the various institutions around the city, colleges, universities, and other such organisations, museums and the like. There's critically members of the public, and which is all parts of the city, including nearby communities and the wider district, all age groups, and particularly trying to reach underrepresented groups. We know Winchester has a very highly engaged core of residents who get involved in things, but we also need to go beyond those groups and find ways to reach them. And we're starting to get some insight into how to do that already from some of the people that we've been speaking to. There's the businesses in Winchester, there's culture and interest groups within Winchester, there's the various landowners, again, who I've spoken to you about a little bit already. There's the third sector and the voluntary sector, and how can we help and support them? Rather than try and replicate what they're doing, can we support them in doing what they do, because they're experts? And then there's the media, which we have to manage as well. And the way we manage and connect with these people is different. It's not one size fits all. So for our, so this is, you can't really see that, but it's a ghosted out version of that slide. For Winchester City Council and stakeholders, it will basically be how we engage them on what we call project level working. So it's our normal day-to-day, our professional teams working with those groups of people, engaging with them in the way we would do on any other project. However, as your partner here, we're feeling like they are going to be more closely involved in some of the activities. We see that the way to get close to the institutions is to probably start with the city centre partnership, since all the institutions are represented there, and that would be our first port of call in terms of setting up a sort of meet and greet and getting to understand and know those institutions. The general public, as I said, the Commonplace platform is our kind of universal catch-all, but we will be having the drop-ins and we will be having the other sessions that I've outlined, but really Commonplace as a digital platform enables us to reach many, many people. We will connect with the businesses through the BID, the LEP, Chamber of Commerce and Business South. And we'll be using one-to-one sessions with the culture and interest groups. So the Winchester's Trust, the cycling groups, the WINAC, you know, we want to actually get and meet those organisations one-to-one and understand their position and points of view. Similarly, landowners, you can only really meet one-to-one because you put them all into a room. It's not a particularly pretty sight. So we'll be talking to them individually about how we can work with those organisations. Eventually, obviously, we'll bring everybody into the tent, one would hope. And the third sector, we'll be working with Winchester City Council's communities team, who obviously have those connections out into those third sector organisations. And with the media, it will be a very traditional, dare I say, PR and comms plan, which this isn't. This is an engagement plan, which we'll use to communicate with the media and hopefully build on the positive feedback we've had to date and use them to get the message out aligned with what we're doing on Commonplace, for example. So we think the media has an important role to play in this process. A roadmap to do that, I've probably said most of this already, and I'm probably running tight on time, so I'll just flick through this just to remind people. Hopefully you've got that in the piece of paper near you, because it's hard to read on here. We had the press launch and members briefing and the town hall session back in March. Our process along the top there is to listen, reflect and assimilate. Most of that arrow along the top is listening. We have these three critical dates, the 7th of June, the 4th of October and the 31st of Jan in terms of the Cabinet Regeneration Committee. So that's our drumbeat for the work that we're doing. Before this session, we have technically launched Commonplace, although in a soft launch, so that does exist, it is up and running, and we'll be promoting that after this meeting, subject to any questions that we take. And we have been engaging the Kingswalk community. We then start our regular drop-ins for the public and active engagement with stakeholders. We then enrich that stakeholder map, make sure we've got everybody included on it, and then hold the 4 stakeholder workshops. We then establish our youth and futures group, because I think people come out through that process that want to be more involved, because there will be a commitment in time from those groups, and we want to make sure that they have that available. Then after the 4th of October Cabinet Committee, we then put everything we found up to that point onto the Commonplace platform, expand the engagement questionnaire that sits on Commonplace, and actually start to, in a sense, consult on what we found out through the stakeholder session at that point. We will then have our co-creation sessions where we sort of mix it up a bit, and that quite nicely, you know, we're quite happy for that to be quite messy, because it's going to be lots of different people, lots of different views, but you know, that's where the creative magic can happen, and we're not afraid of it. We then, hidden behind the box, which is conveniently on this computer, which I can't see. Ugh. I knew that was going to happen. There's a little box on the computer that's hiding that. It was going so well. Yeah, sorry, the second from last box is sharing the engagement outputs and project brief evaluation, which again would go to the Regen committee in January, and subject to that being approved, we'll then produce our engagement document that we actually see almost like a sister document to the SPD. So you've got the work of the SPD, and we want to see this second document sits next to it. It says, you said this back in 2018, we've done this work with you through 2023. We think this is where we're sitting now. This is what we'd like to be doing this is our brief, and then we're going to go forward from that point and start to design a scheme which we can then, in a sense, consult on in a more traditional planning process. But we'd like to keep the spirit of what we're doing here alive through the whole process, really. And that's really a summary of our engagement strategy as it sits today. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Wallace, would you like to come forward and make any comments?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for providing this update. It's great that see this important project moving forward. And I had a couple of questions, but I think you mainly answered the first one actually, which is great. As you know, the MPPF states that achieving sustainable development means that the planning system has three overarching objectives: an economic objective, a social objective, and an environmental objective. The economics of the project are part of regular reviews as part of the business case development, and social issues. If you know, it's great talking through the stakeholder engagement plan, and hopefully we'll make sure that social issues are captured through that. I think that the environmental one is the one that I perhaps is most often missed or not done as thoroughly as it could be. Obviously, you mentioned it's great to hear that you're talking to Cycle Winchester and Winnack, but obviously we need to make sure that that continues through the different stages of that pyramid of consensus building. So we don't just do it at the bottom, but actually as one of the three parts of the things we're trying to pull together. I'm not sure you mentioned it as one of those four groups you're talking about.
It was actually the fourth, but I didn't mention it, but you just reminded me that
Right,
that was the fourth one.
fantastic. So we're done.
That wasn't a trick, by the way. I didn't leave one blank so I could just fill it in with whatever
Great.
somebody asked.
That's great. I think I'll leave that one there. So that's it's great. It all sounds like we're looking at the right things. So it's great to hear. Thank you. My second question is actually, I've just realised, is related to item 9. It's very quick. I could raise it now or come back on item 9.
But I think it's better if we move all the discussion into one place. Very happy to have you back at that.
Thank you.
Particular one. I played too hardball on the chairing on that one. Good, and thank you for those points, and thank you, John, for using your alarming mind reading skills to preempt all the questions that Councillor Wallace wanted to ask, all the points he wanted to raise. Colleagues, are there any questions that you have? Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just one quick question. You mentioned all the stakeholders, but you didn't specifically mention the universities that we've got in town. Now, obviously, I believe both of them are Winchester and Southampton are represented on the city centre partnership, but are you planning any sort of separate discussions with those, because they're obviously major employers in our town, and also because we're hoping to, through this Central Winchester Regeneration, attract more young people to, you know, come live and work in the city. Obviously, the universities are a great start with that. So just wondering what your plans are for the universities in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. Universities are on our list. I'm trying to remember, did the spreadsheet get circulated with the stakeholder list on it? Not the cabinet, okay. So yeah, so in a sense, part of this process is also making sure we haven't missed anybody. So it'd be quite useful to perhaps share that document where we listed everybody that we're currently aware of, not individuals, but organisations. And you're exactly right. My strategy, or our strategy around the universities, is to talk to them about their graduates was a way of because in a sense that's, you know, they're experts at what they do, but what we want is, you know, to keep the graduates here. So that was the kind of headline. But yes, they're definitely in our crosshairs. That's even, if I'm allowed to say that.
I think you are. Councillor Bolton.
Thank you, Chair. On the subject of sort of wider residents of the district, you mentioned that you're looking to consult some of the near neighbours and that sort of thing to the development. But given that you know, it's quite a big district and those residents are also paying the bills, what's your plan to try and include the views of the wider district?
Yeah, so
Thank you.
again, my notes sort of say we probably need to reach out to the parish councils and local councillors to help set up some sessions, those that feel that would be beneficial, some sessions in local town hall, local village halls, or places that we can meet at times that make sense for people to get to them. And as I said, this first stage is listen to their concerns. You know, what is it that they want from Winchester, and how do they see the Central Winchester Regeneration project being able to further that cause in a way. So and actually interesting, when we met WINAC, they were talking, they've got, I think, 14 sort of affiliate groups around the region. So some of those sit in the villages. So we started to speak to them about whether they could start sounding out which particular places have the most vocal or organised residents groups, so that we can contact. So I think we just want to roll up our sleeves and get out there and meet people. And you know, actually, if then other parishes or other councils say we want you to come to our village, great. You know, we'll do as many as we can. I think, but we just need to get out there and listen.
You luck with that, because they do often clash, the parish meetings. So welcome to our world, I think, is the answer to that. Just one other thing was about the development agreement, and when will that be finalised and shared with the council?
So the Councillor Bolton, you may recall that effectively the delegation agreement was delegated to officers to negotiate the details with, and then engage with the relevant portfolio holder meeting to sign. As I said, at this point in time, we are finalising a couple of final points and made very good progress. The intention is that there will then be a final development agreement, which, as I said, we'll be doing two things. Obviously, we will be sharing that with our portfolio holder, but at the same time, it will then be going to our development partners, our consortium members, for their boards to sign off. And of course, the complication is that you've got effectively four parties which all need to sign off, albeit that they're consortium, with the main, the lead party, the final sign off, being an organisation who report up to Japan. So there's a sort of, well, the nature of, you know, but that's where the parent company sort of effectively sits. So as I said, I mean, the timelines that they've given us is that they will start the process of securing their various board approvals and sign off on the 28th of June, with the final sign off being the week commencing 24th of July. At which point, once there is that, then from their side, all the board members have agreed. Then there'll be a signing process, and then beyond that, at this point in time, we're then looking for the first board meeting, which is part of the council's governance process, which we agreed as part of the governance process for this project, to then take place. At this point in time, we're looking for dates in August. Yeah, so the sense, and then beyond that, the governance process will be, and that is made up of board members for effectively representatives on each side, and the board meeting will then go into the sort of monthly cycles of meetings.
And if I'm correct, this then becomes the main reporting mechanism back to this meeting becomes the main.
That's correct.
Back to the council. Councillor Godfrey.
Just to follow up, Matt, at that point, the signature of a DA will be available for all councillors to view in its full form, obviously with some restrictions, I suspect.
I think we may need to take guidance from the monitoring officer, but my bias, as you know, is that I would like all councillors to be able to see things, but obviously
I'm unable to answer that precisely at this moment, but as the leader has already indicated, we certainly do our best with regard to allowing all members to see as much as we can commercially, and that will obviously be the mind that we have in mind when we look at the DA when it comes in. Again, the status of it changes once it is signed, but there may be aspects of commerciality and sensitivities that we will have to be mindful of, but we will certainly be able to update you with regard to that. Thank you.
Councillor Godfrey.
Sorry, and another point meant to be made of discussions with the Council Highways Authority about movement strategy and impact on this project. Apart from having meetings, is it possible to outline what progress has been made with those discussions and what actions are coming out of those meetings in relation to the movement around the CWR site?
I'm not sure we're able to sort of introduce a brand new report into the meeting, but I think a verbal update of where we are, and perhaps a separate discussion about how we have that feedback loop back to wider members is a good one. Councillor Lerney, you're the cabinet member responsible for that. Can you provide a bit of perspective?
So certainly we do have regular meetings with the county council and the city council to update on all aspects of the movement strategy. The central Winchester regeneration aspect of that has been in somewhat of a hiatus due to the taking on of the development partner and waiting for further plans to emerge. As you're aware, a lot of work had been done around movement around the site, particularly around the aspects of how buses might operate in the future. But obviously, here we go again. That will be revisited as we progress further into the scheme, but I'm very happy to bring a verbal update back to this meeting at regular intervals.
So the risk has not yet been mitigated in any way?
The risk around...
Chair, please. Sorry, What was the question again? I didn't hear it.
The risk has not been mitigated in any way because there's no progress and no actions coming out of discussions with HCC. I'm looking at the.
We're not on the risk register yet.
I'm sorry, but
I'm
concerned about when we mentioned the.
No, we will come to you. Let's keep the focus on what we've got in front of us today. So we will come to the risk register in a minute, and I know it's also something which Councillor Wallace wants to talk about. So in terms of what this agenda item is, I'll remind you that the updates that we've had that we are discussing are development partner announcement, which I think is old news, but it's good to repeat it. It's something we like to say over and over again. The draft development agreement and the status of that and its agreement, which we've touched on, and you've asked some further questions about that. There is the archaeology trial trenching, where I think we had all the clarity about that, although actually I do have a question as to when the next meeting of the archaeology committee, do we have one scheduled? Right. So we will have the archaeology advisory panel at the end of July. Thank you. That was my extra question on that one. The status of King's Walk, the Friarsgate Medical Centre, and of course the stakeholder engagement plan. So we will come to the risk register in a minute, and you're absolutely right to be raising questions. But I just wondered, Councillor Cremoyson, on the items that I've just talked about that was within the scope of the updates.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure you'll set me straight if I drift off. So thanks for the update on that. Just want to clarify, ask for some clarification on the green piece of jigsaw at the end, towards the end of the snaking route, where it says sharing of engagement outputs and project brief evolution. Essentially, what I want to clarify is what form is that going to take? Is it a public thing, or is it for members, or is there one bit for members and one bit for the public? Just really trying to understand to what extent the project brief and the, if you like, the sub aspects of the product, the engagement document and so on, are going to be made visible to the public before it comes to this committee. I'm sure we'll have huge transparency at this committee, but just, you know, so that we have some understanding of where the public are feeling about things at that point. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so working backwards, as you suggest, is once we've agreed it, we want it to be as widely shared as possible. We want to use Commonplace to share what happens in public sessions, and I think that includes the stakeholder themed workshops and the co-creation sessions, because there will be some members potentially of the public in there, and we don't see the need to try and close that all down. I think as we draw conclusions from that, we'll probably have a sort of a chain of sign off. So within the team, and then within the at board level, and then this group, and then when this group's happy with it, it will then get published. So it will be staged. It won't go. A final document won't go out into the public realm until this group's had a chance to look at it. This group won't get to look at it until the board gets to look at it, and the board doesn't get to look at it until the team, along with key officers, are comfortable with it as well. So, yeah.
Any further questions or comments? Good. So, John, thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you both, Johns, for your update today. It's greatly appreciated, and greatly appreciated the energy and activity that you're bringing to this project to drive things ahead. We continue to be very excited. Particularly, thank you.
We're really enjoying it.
That's a good thing. I'm very pleased to hear it. The next item on the agenda is the CWR risk register, which is, oh, I've got a nice big version here. I'm also looking at my screen. And this is the key risks. It's not everything. I think it's going to be introduced by Dawn Adey and John East. As you know, I am a huge risk register fan, and I'm a great believer in trying to capture the risks that we face in terms of our projects, and to make sure we confront them. And dare I say it, the risk that so interested Councillor Godfrey is one that I personally added to the list. So great minds think alike, fools seldom differ, take your pick. In terms of the risk register, colleagues, I think we all know how this works. I don't know if Ms. Zadie wants to add a few words. Yep, fire away. Or Mr. East.
Thank you, Leader. Your delegated matters are to ensure effective actions are in place to address key risks
This risk register has been refreshed as the previous risk register was based on the risk of the procurement not being successful. So this has moved us into the next phase of the project, and it's therefore a fresh risk register for you to look at today.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Wallace, come and make your pre-deputation on top.
Thank you, Chair. I hope this is just a very quick one. There are 7 risks on the risk register. Probability of each is 26 to 50%, which would say that 2 of these are likely to happen in the next 5 years. So it's now's the tricky part. Now, do we have? It's a difficult question to answer. But does the project have reserves, financial or otherwise, to cover several of these risks being realised?
Well, there you go. That is reserves and or mitigation plans, or you're talking about the level of risk implied by the residual risk.
Well, it's very easy to look at a risk register and say, oh, they're all unlikely. But actually, if you look at the percentages, it's unlikely means it's 26 to 50% likely to happen. With 7 risks, that means that roughly two are going to happen. That's what they're saying in that risk register. So if 2 of those happen, so 26 to 50%, times each risk is at 26 to 50%. You've got 7 risks. It ends up you're likely that 2 of those will actually be realised. So we obviously need to make sure that we have reserves in place, or whatever that is, financial, schedule, whatever, to be able to cope with that. And that's, I know it's a very, very difficult question to answer because I'm kind of covering all 7, but yeah, good luck. So,
Mrs. Adey, yeah, that feels like a one for you. John, you champing at the bit?
Not particularly champing at the bit, but just to say that, I mean, there's 2 things. One, I think we need to recognise that the whole point of procuring a development partner following an outline business case was to, dare I say it, transfer a lot of the risk onto the development partner. So this is not a project where we are going to be putting in our money. We're putting obviously in our land. The whole point of this project is for the development partner to enable us to realise our vision. So the development partner carries a lot of the risk, you know. So, and that was like, you know, in a sense, the process which the council went through, you know, quite exhaustively, you know, in terms of deciding the right approach for realising Central Winchester. So that's the first thing. Secondly, as part of that, the development partner have their own risk register, which, you know, will be in considerably more detail for fairly obvious reasons than this, and this is our strategic risks. And the development partner's risks will be, once the development agreement is signed, will form part of the process of regular reporting to the board. You know, so a key part of what the board will be doing, which, as I said before, is made up of equal entities in terms of council representatives and development partner representatives, will be to assess the board at each stage. That's from the effectively how, you know, effectively where we got to in terms of overall risk for the project. But in terms of one of the risks which are highlighted here is obviously, you know, dare I say that you know, the development partner effectively doesn't do what they say they're going to do, then that the key mechanism which we have is basically through the development agreement. And for that, what we've built in is effectively penalty clauses if there are things like unacceptable delays, which are the development partners' responsibility. The fact that we're not just giving the whole land to them willy-nilly, that they have to effectively deliver on each project before they have things like land released, and effectively various clauses to ensure they can't walk away from the project, you know, and we're left sort of high and dry. So those are built into the development agreement, of which the council saw and assessed through the decision making back in March. Gave considerable consideration to, as also did, if you recall, the scrutiny committee.
Thank you, Mr. East. And yes, and I'm not going to get into a statistical argument, but I was flashing back to my statistics paper as part of a very long time ago economics degree. But anyway, but let's not forget that we do actually, there's also a calculation to be done to say there's between 15 and 75% chance on each of the risks that nothing happens. And so there is actually a measurable level of nothing happening as well, which I won't get into what I calculated it to be. But anyway, no doubt the commenters on the Hampshire Chronicle can supply an appropriate statistical analysis. Anyway, any other questions or comments? Councillor Godfrey raised the issue of the last risk, which is inability to resolve issues with the movement strategy, with movement related issues. And if we don't do anything, then that is clearly a significant risk, but there is a mitigation listed, which is using movement strategy governance, and something that we haven't talked about in great depth, but the county has set up, which is the Regeneration and Growth Partnership Board, to resolve issues, and also bringing the development partner into those discussions as needed. We did talk about some extra mitigation, and as I was walking back down the aisle from the RLC church service, I did talk to the leader of Hampshire and say, I would like to make sure that you, your relevant cabinet member and your senior directors meet the new development partner so that we know that there is sort of top level engagement and awareness of what we're doing. And that hopefully is something that then can feed through the entire organisation, because certainly what we found is if people are clear that people at the top are talking to each other about a particular issue, it eases the path throughout the entire organisation. I don't know if that addresses your point, Councillor Godfrey.
I think it's. I'm grateful for the update. I think there's a significant risk for the project. It's been good to see it being addressed with actions, which we'll have to monitor as we go along.
Absolutely, and I think the offer from Councillor Lerney to ensure that there is, as appropriate, reporting back into this committee from any aspects of the movement strategy that relate to our major redevelopment projects is an offer that I think we'd want to take up and is a useful addition to the mitigation. Zadie.
Just want to confirm as well, as a dependency of this project, it would also be reported through the performance management system if the dependency was in the way. So obviously we're dependent on the movement strategy delivery. So you get to it's not only this meeting that will be surfacing that sort of barrier if it is in the way. Of course, it's only a risk at the moment.
No, that's very helpful. So it will be it falls into the format that we use for project reporting in the quarterly report, which is a useful thing to highlight as well. Are there any other questions or comments or missing risks? Councillor Bolton.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested to understand, under insufficient council resources, where this has been classed as likelihood unlikely but significant in impact, and the unlikely is obviously up to 50% chance in 5 years. With a medium-term financial plan that states that we're going to run out of money, how do we weigh that in terms of we're trying to estimate the risk currently, and then there are mitigating factors that then resolve risk, and I wondered how Cabinet sort of weighed that little juxtaposition.
But I think the first point I'd say is that we're clear that we're not going to run out of money, because we will take the decisions necessary to ensure that we don't, and we are in a better position than many of the authorities that are facing major financial challenge at the moment. But that is something I know that Councillor Cutler will be coming back to us all on, highlighting what we are going to be doing for the programme that we're putting in place to ensure that we remain financially viable. I think there is one of the questions this puts on the table in terms of resource is, to paraphrase Yoda, do or do not. You know, we need to decide if we're doing something, we do it and we resource it, or we don't do it. But what we can't do is pretend we're doing something and not resource it. And that will be one of the decision-making process. I don't know if Councillor Cutler is the owner of that process, or Mrs. Ailey wants to add any further perspective.
Well, if I may, I'll just add a little bit to it in terms of the way one measures these things. You know, we were talking about a risk over 5 years. Medium-term financial strategy is over 5 years. Medium-term financial strategy shows the problem towards the end of the 5 years. So we have time to address it, and therefore I would suggest that it is right that it's there in that category of unlikely, I suppose, simply because that's how you measure risk. We will deal with that problem. The problem is unforeseen things, isn't it? Really, that is why it remains a risk. That would be my argument on it, my take on it, because we're talking about that possibility over that period of time.
I think it's useful to make reference to the medium-term financial strategy potentially as part of our mitigation, but it sounds like there's always a slight risk, which is there's an action which is in another document which we don't have here. So there's a bit of me that is always slightly allergic to see elsewhere, and it might be useful if we could have the mitigation that is covered in whatever the corporate risk register copied into this document, so that we can see what it is. Mrs. Ailey.
Thank you. We were noted your request. We were trying not to put it in two places, because then we're at risk of having different things written in two places for the same risk. So we'll try and work that through to a way that meets all of our needs. I just wanted to follow Councillor Cutler. The risk in the corporate risk register is not just financial. It's if there's another flood that lasts for 12 weeks, if there's another pandemic that takes your senior resource in a different direction, there is a risk. So again, not likely, unlikely as noted, but it's not just the financial strategy risk.
Thank you very much indeed for that clarification. That's very helpful. I'm not seeing any other hands. I think it's useful, dare I say it, it shows the power of the risk register, that we have actually talked about what are the threats to this project and what we do about it. That's why I believe they're a good idea, something that merits attention. I just think we're noting this, is that right? Exactly.
May Chair, you're ensuring effective actions are in place to address the key risks.
I'm ensuring effective actions. Okay, well, I think we've had that discussion. I think we've clarified a couple of steps that we want to take to make things slightly clearer. But otherwise, I think that item is done. And I think then, since we decided earlier that the next item on the agenda, which was an exempt discussion of the capacity study, we didn't need to do. I think we have reached the end of our agenda, covered everything on it. Can I thank John East and his teams for everything they've done to get this meeting ready, and also Zadie for the work with the wider council. It's much appreciated, knowing that the projects are in such safe hands, and it's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much indeed. And on that note, I declare the meeting closed.